this week, U.S. President Joe Biden delivers his second State of the Union address to a divided Congress amid challenges on multiple fronts. We'll discuss U.S. domestic and foreign policy priorities and how they may affect America's global engagement. Also, I speak to Sudanese-British philanthropist Mo Ibrahim on the state of governance across Africa. How is the continent faring? We'll see what the Ibrahim Index reveals about governance in African countries. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to Straight Talk Africa. I'm Haydé Adams. We are coming to you from our studios in Washington, D.C., where U.S. President Joe Biden delivered his second State of the Union address Tuesday evening to a divided Congress, touting his accomplishments and laying out the challenges the U.S. faces at home and abroad. Now, in a speech that emphasized global threats to democracy, Mr. Biden said the United States and the world stand at an inflection point in history. And now for a closer look at the State of the Union address and the U.S. President's domestic and foreign policy priorities, I'm joined by Johanna Leblanc. She's the managing partner at Jleblanc Global Consulting. And joining us from Rabat, Morocco is Calvin Dark. Calvin, thank you for always joining us wherever you find yourself in the world. And a warm welcome to you as well, Johanna. Thanks to both of you. Johanna, I want to start out with you. What did you think of the State of the Union address we heard last night and what it said about President Biden's accomplishments and shortcomings, both at home and abroad?
I think President Biden's State of the Union address yesterday was excellent. I think that he was talking to the American people, explaining some of the challenges that he's faced and also appealing to the American people that if you were to give me a second term, these are the things that I would accomplish, knowing that during this Congress will not be able to deliver some of his objectives. But some of his accomplishments have been, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has pushed out billions of dollars in building roads across the nation, providing broadband and providing access to the internet to countless people across this country. And also, Biden has been committed to police reform, which is why you had the George Floyd legislation, unfortunately, that was introduced in the House, passed in the House, but didn't go anywhere in the Senate. But also, I think it was an opportunity for Biden to also talk to the American people about running for a second term. I think in any given day now, we should expect that announcement. It will be more than likely he and maybe President Trump. We don't know who the Democratic Party is going to choose ultimately. But during his State of the Union address, there was a lot of humor, which I thought was very significant. For example, one of them was that when you talk about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, a number of cities across the nation and states received significant funding, and some of the Republicans did not vote for the legislation, but they went back to their cities and their towns and to brag about that they've brought home the bacon, that they've brought home resources to their constituents. So I think Biden talked about that and said, even though you did not vote for the bipartisan infrastructure bill for some of our initiatives, but I'll be more than happy to come to your town and talk to your constituents.
And see you at the groundbreaking. I
Absolutely.
remember him saying, well, Calvin, of course, it's always in the interest of the party in power to tout their accomplishments. And as Johanna mentioned, all the speculation around President Biden deciding to run again for a second term. What was your take on what you heard last night?
Well, definitely we saw a President Biden that has a lot of energy for an 80-year-old. I think that was reassuring for a lot of the Democrats in the audience. And I think Biden's biggest challenge domestically was obviously he wanted to, and he did, tout the legislative wins, tout the economic progress. But what he tried to do, and I think he did a good job at it, was to make this case to the American people whose pocketbooks contradict that message. Although Biden has the facts and figures and statistics on his side, it's still hard for some Americans to realize just how much our economy has improved. I also think that one of the things I was looking for is what are the possibilities of bipartisan cooperation? Now, I don't feel that they're any more likely after last night, But what I did see that I hadn't seen in Joe Biden in a long time was Senator Joe Biden, who knew how these caucuses work. When he did the ad-libbed comments that were not a part of his speech, that came from Biden, who spent decades in the Senate. I just hope we see more of that because he knows how it works. He knows what he's got to do. And I think if he does that more, he'll have an even more successful 2 years.
Yes, this was certainly interesting, the ebbs and the flows in the speech last night. But Johanna, there was a really emotional moment, or at least something that I found to be very emotional. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And this was when President Biden spoke about police reform, and especially what happened in the light of the death of Tyre Nichols. Now, for those who don't know, this young man was on January 7th. He was beaten by Tennessee police in Memphis to within an inch of his life. He died 3 days later, and President Biden invited Nichols' parents to attend the State of the Union address. Let's take a listen to what he said.
As many of you personally know, there's no words to describe the heartache or grief of losing a child. But imagine if you lost that child at the hands of the law. Imagine having to worry whether your son or daughter came home from walking down the street, or playing in the park, or just driving a car. Most of us in here have never had to have the talk that brown and black parents have had to have with their children. Bo, Hunter, Ashley, my children. I never had to have the talk with them. I never had to tell them if a police officer pulls you over, turn your interior lights on right away. Don't reach for your license. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. Imagine having to worry like that every single time your kid got in a car.
Well, Johanna, I think this is probably one issue that many people across the African continent can relate to, police brutality. This is something in the country that I'm from, South Africa, and I know this is an issue in places like Kenya, in places like Nigeria, and many other places on the continent, this issue of police brutality. Here in the United States, Tyre Nichols' death has revived the call and the pressure on the Democrats and President Biden to do something on police reform. You spoke about this a little earlier. Why has nothing substantial happened on this measure just yet?
Well, it's a very loaded question, Haydé. But what we know for certain is that when it comes to the issue of police brutality in this country, historically we've seen more of white officers, inflicting harm on black men and black women in this country. In this case, it's rather different because you have black police officers who committed this act, right? So some are saying, is it really race, or is it just are these just bad cops? Well, unfortunately, race always plays a role in it, because the idea is that as a person of color, as a black person in America, your skin color is being weaponized, right? So before they see you, before you speak, your color is seen as a weapon. It's being threatened to certain people, right? And also, we've seen historically there hasn't been much accountability. Yes, there have been major significant wins when it comes to these civil suits, but in terms of actually holding those perpetrators truly accountable for their actions, we have not seen too many of that, which is why we need police reform. We need a system that will hold these institutions liable for the acts that are committed by police officers. Look, one of the things that I've learned when I was in law school, I took a very critical class that changed my perspective on race relations in America. It's a class called Race and Law. And in that class, I got to learn how our policies, our laws, systematically oppress a certain group in this country, right? So racism is embedded in our public policy, unfortunately. So what I've learned from that class is that, yes, laws are important because you need a piece of legislation, you need a piece of law once you've been harmed to go in front of a body of a judge to receive redress. But what's also important here is that the hearts of men must change. We must have these hard, tough internal conversations with our friends, with our families, with ourselves as to why do we fear certain groups? Why do we think certain groups are lesser than them? And that is something that no Congress can legislate.
I want to move on. This is such a deep subject. We're going to get back to this again, Johanna, because I have many questions and thoughts about it. But Calvin, President Biden came out very strong and vigorously on America's position and priorities when it comes to Russia and China. Let's take a listen.
Putin's invasion has been a test for the ages, a test for America, a test for the world. Would we stand for the most basic of principles? Would we stand for sovereignty? Would we stand for the right of people to live free of tyranny? Would we stand for the defense of democracy? For such defense matters to us because it keeps peace and prevents open season on would-be aggressors and threatens our prosperity. 1 year later, we know the answer. Yes, we would, and we did. We did. I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world, but make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
Well, Calvin, the so-called Chinese spy balloon incident has been dominating headlines here in the United States. Republicans have criticized President Biden for letting the balloon float over the United States for days before actually shooting it down. How is the U.S. likely to respond to this incident?
Well, I think that's the major question, because there were a lot of influential Republicans who took this more politically than it should have been. You know, he wasn't shooting it down. They criticized him for that. And then when he did shoot it down, they said it wasn't done fast enough. So I think we have to separate out the politically motivated comments we hear that are meant to weaken Biden, particularly if he runs in 2024. We have to separate that from the legitimate criticism, because there are a lot of things that the Biden administration needs to explain. Why we weren't on top of this as we should. How long is it? When has this happened before? And more importantly, what do we have in place so that I don't get texts from my relatives in North Carolina about the balloon flying over my house? So that's what I think the Biden administration has to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the criticism we're seeing from the Republicans is purely political and not constructive.
Johanna, the president also talked about PEPFAR. This was, of course, introduced by former U.S. President George W. Bush 20 years ago. PEPFAR has saved tens of millions of lives, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa. How significant and effective has PEPFAR been across the continent, very briefly?
Well, since 2003 up until 2021, we know the United States government has spent over $100 billion. And this program has significant support by Congress and bipartisan support at that. And as you know, Congress has the power of the purse. If Congress does not release the funds, no project no initiative could really move forward. But I think that there has been some successes. Obviously, we look at places like Eswatini that was ravaged with HIV and AIDS at a period of time. We've seen the number has decreased. We look at South Africa, for example, as well. We see that the number has also decreased. But what we're also seeing is that there's been an increase in terms of infection, but it's a particular age group. We're looking at, I believe in South Africa, we're looking at 18 to 20 something, right? And that is problematic. So I think that there has to be a restructure, reshift on how to address this issue across the African continent, because what worked 10 years ago will not work in 2022.
Right, and let's not forget that HIV, especially in South Africa, it wiped out an entire generation. We had grandparents living with children. The parents were completely, a whole generation wiped out, and it affected our economies and our way of life. But Johanna Leblanc, thank you very much. And Calvin Dock, thank you both for your time. I'll have you back on the show again next time. I do appreciate it. Well, still ahead here on Straight Talk Africa. The 2022 Ibrahim Index of African Governance is out. What does Africa's overall governance scorecard say? And how do African nations fare on gender equality, rule of law, as well as economic and political rights? Well, after the break, my conversation with Sudanese-British philanthropist Mo Ibrahim. He'll give us the context and the details. Don't go away. Stay with us.
from around the world. Let's go.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. For over a decade now, Sudanese-British philanthropist Mo Ibrahim has been shining a light on governance in Africa. Every 2 years, the Ibrahim Index of African Governance provides comprehensive data and key insight into how well African countries are governed. The 2022 index report is now out. How well have African countries fared? What should we be worried about? And what should we feel optimistic about? I put those questions to Mo Ibrahim when he joined me via Skype from the United Kingdom. I began by asking him what the Ibrahim Index for African Governance measures, how it measures, and what it hopes to accomplish.
We believe governance is measurable. And instead of nice speeches and polemics, we need data, information. And what we try to measure is what we call deliverables. What is the job of the government? The government needs to deliver to the people, to deliver better health, better education, better infrastructure, jobs, security, rule of law. All these things are measurable. And what we try to do is to collect as much data as possible. We have over 40 organizations worldwide who supply us with their data. We go in and fill in the gaps in this data as well. The index contains some over 200,000 data points, and this is reduced into 4 main categories. One is security and rule of law, and one is economic opportunity, everything to do with the economy, and one is about rights, participation, and human rights, democracy, etc. And one is about the human development, health, education, gender issues, etc. These are the 4 main categories, and we try to produce that complete picture of governance at that point of time in Africa through data. And what we're trying to do is to produce tools to help develop policies, because without data, how can people really manage and govern a country? It's important to develop policies based on data.
And I've heard you say that without data, governments are essentially driving blind. And so the 2022 IIAG report is now out. Can you give us an idea of what your main finding was?
Right. What we try to look is at really the trends in governance. So we look at a period of 10 years, and what we see over the past 10 years is that governance in general in Africa has improved over the past 10 years. That's good news. But there is some issues also around that. Governance have developed for about 7 years, between 2012 up to 2019, and then in the last 3 years it stagnated. It's sort of flattened, and that is worrying. Also, we noticed that most of the improvement really happened in 2 of the 4 categories, which is economic opportunities and human development. This should have been the driver pushing the performance of our governments forward. But at the same time, we see deterioration in 2 other categories. One is security and rule of law, and the other one is democracy and rights. Unfortunately, we started to stagnate, and we're ringing some alarm bells here we need to pay attention.
And I want to delve a little deeper into what you show us some worrying trends. What, in your view, is the greatest concern that we should have right now?
We really are concerned about the situation of security and rule of law. This has been deteriorating over the last 10 years. So that makes our people less safe. And it is worrying. On participation and human rights and democracy, we see also stagnation there. Since 2019, over the past 3 years, we had 2 military takeovers, 8 coups in Africa in just 3 years. This is a worrying trend of military taking over, and we know what happened then. We see that the space for civil society is closing. That is also worrying to us. So we're really worrying about these main 2 issues: security, rule of law, and the issue of freedom and participation of our people.
And your report does show there have been 23 successful and attempted coups on the African continent since 2012. You list a dozen of countries affected there. And then there's this surprising statistic that almost 70% of Africans now live in a country where there is conflict, of course. And that is very alarming, because armed conflict and other violence, you say, is worse now than it was 10 years ago. What does that say about the continent's ability to meet the challenges of its own security?
That is a very, very good question. It is really an important issue we need to face. And the reason for insecurity and conflicts, I think there are 2 main reasons. One, of course, is failure of governance. Any conflict has roots in socio-economic situation, marginalization of communities, etc. And the way the government handles this conflicts. The other reason also is really out of our hands, which is climate change. Climate is causing problems in Africa. The 10 most affected countries in the world by climate change are all African countries. What that result in is some serious problems. For example, we have large communities which are essentially herders. People raise animals. They need to graze. And because of climate change, they lose the grazing lands. Then they move with their animals towards more fertile lands. But that is farmers there who try to grow their own food. And obviously you can see the conflict between 2 communities, the farmers and the herders. That is essentially caused by climate change. But also, we probably don't handle, or some governments don't handle this properly, and that worsens the situation. So there is various reasons causing the conflict and security, but governance is really at the heart of this, how to manage that. And that's something we really need to do with it, and we need to find an African solution for it. And it is very sad to see some governments opt out to hire mercenaries from Russia, Wagner Group, etc., as it happened in 2 or 3 countries in Africa, which will do nothing to help security of our people.
You also mentioned some bright spots, though, reasons to be optimistic, and you mentioned some earlier, but especially around the issue of gender. I found that quite interesting and really showed the value of measuring. We advocate for these things, but it's very important to go back and actually measure our performance here. Gender, very interesting. How well are we faring on that score?
This is one of the bright spots really in the report. Gender really situation has improved quite a lot, consistently, year after year. And it's really wonderful. Just a word of caution here. We are not there yet because we are coming from a very low base. And we need to continue this improvement. But it is heartening that it is happening. This is wonderful. We also like the developments in infrastructure. It's positive. It's happening everywhere in Africa. So we are better connected now. We have better infrastructure in general in Africa. But again, like gender, we're coming from a very low base. There is still so much ground really to be covered.
Mo, just something that is really in your wheelhouse, of course, internet and connectivity. And then the other issue where we lack connectivity, and that is electricity. And I've heard you talk about the importance for our economies that we have electricity for people in African countries. But when you have a shortage of electricity and you have rolling blackouts in some of the largest economies in Africa, like Nigeria and South Africa, the country that I am from, I mean, it still boggles the mind. How big is this problem, and how can it be overcome?
This is a very serious problem. You are absolutely right. We have 600 million people, almost 50% of our people, without access to electricity. Without access to electricity, you don't have access to life. You don't have education, you don't have health, you don't have business, you have nothing. And that is a serious problem. We really need to deal with it urgently. And we need to focus on really providing electricity, while at the same time, of course, maintaining our march towards a green economy.
Mo, one final question. Was there a region or a country that really gave you the most hope when you really looked at the data and you really considered how well or how poorly we're doing in areas? Is there a country or region that other African countries can look to or learn from as a way to do certain things right?
I think we have a number of countries which are really doing wonderful. We have Botswana, is a wonderful governance. Historically has been really great. We have Namibia, we have Mauritius, we have Seychelles, we have Cabo Verde. There's a number really of countries which are really doing well. And I hope we can see more countries, especially the large countries, you know, where we're still waiting for Nigeria to move forward. And again, South Africa is going backward, unfortunately. It's very important, your own country. That should have been the locomotive to pull the region forward. But unfortunately, it's dealing with some difficult issues.
And that is Mo Ibrahim. There's the founder and the chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, speaking to me from the United Kingdom. And that is where we will leave it for this week. Thank you so much for joining us here on Straight Talk Africa from our team here in Washington. Thank you for always watching. Thank you for always listening. And a big thanks to all my guests. Join us again next time. Until then, it's goodbye.